Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. In the last video, we talked about how to change a fraction to a decimal by using mental math or recognition. Now we're going to talk about how you can do that using equivalent fractions. So, in order to use equivalent fractions, you must at the very least know these multiplications. You're going to have to know 2 times 5 is 10. You're going to have to know 2 times 50 is 100. You're going to have to know 5 times 20 is 100. You're going to have to know 4 times 25 is 100. And you're going to have to know 8 times 125 is 1,000. So you really got to know those. And there's some others you could know as well, but for the purposes of right now, you really have to know those multiplications. Now, the way you change a fraction to a decimal using equivalent fractions is something we've actually already done. So let's start with the fraction 1/5. And to make it a fraction, to make it a decimal, well, we want to make it a fraction of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, some version of 10, right? Because we have a base 10 number system. So we can make this one out of 10 by timesing by 2. Then we do the same thing to the top, and you get 2 out of 10. One zero on 10 means 1 decimal spot, and we put the 2 in that decimal spot, and we say we have 2/10. Okay? So we just make the equivalent fraction out of 10, 100, or 1,000, and then convert. The next one, 4/5. I can make that into a fraction out of 10 by timesing by 2, and times by 2. And we get 8/10. And 8/10, for making that a decimal, has 1 decimal spot because there's 1 0 on 10. In that decimal spot, we put an 8, and that's 0 and 8/10. Okay, let's look at some others. 14/20. Can be made into a fraction out of 100 by timesing by 5, timesing by 5. 10 times 5 is 50, 4 times 5 is 20. Together that makes 70 out of 100. Now there are 2 zeros on 100, which means there are going to be 2 decimal spots, and that would be 0 and 70 hundredths, or just 0 and 7/10. And we could have gotten that by just making this a fraction 7 out of 10, right? So there's many ways to do them sometimes. Okay, 3/20, number 4. You can make it into a fraction out of 100 by timesing by 5, times by 5. You get 15/100. 2 decimal spots on 100. That means 2 decimal spots for the decimal. Or 2 zeros on 100, pardon me, which means 2 decimal spots. And in those decimal spots, we put 1 5 and a 0 in front. Okay. Then we can use the 25 fact. 25 times 4 is 100. So 11 times 4 is 44. 2 zeros on 100, which means 2 decimal spots. And in those spots go 4 and 4 and a 0 in front. Number 6, 8 over 25. We can make that into a fraction out of 100 by timesing by 4 and times by 4. And we get 32 out of 100. And once we have it out of 100, then 2 zeros on 100 means 2 decimal spots. In them goes 32 and a 0 in front. 32 hundredths. So, using the idea of equivalent fractions, math is all about building on what we already know. Let's do another one. 11 over 50. We can make that out of 100 by timesing by 2. Timesing by 2. We get 22 out of 100. 2 decimal spots, and in them goes 22 and a 0 in front. Number 8, 3 out of 50. You can make a fraction out of 100 by timesing by 2 and timesing by 2. That'll be 6 out of 100. 2 zeros on 100, which means 2 decimal spots. We need to have 6 hundredths. So this is the tenths. Forgot my decimal. This is the tenths and the hundredths. So we have to have a 6 in the hundredths and a 0 placeholder. 0 and 6 hundredths. And the last 2 I've got here is 1/8. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but 1/8 can be made into a fraction out of 1,000 by timesing by 125 and times by 125. And that gets you 125 over 1,000. Three zeros on 1,000. So 3 decimal spots, and in those decimal spots we put 125 and a 0 in front. That's 125 thousandths. And the last question, 5 over 8. Well, we can make that out of 1,000 by times by 125 times by 125. Okay, 5 times 100 is 500. 5 times, that's a 2, but it's 5 times 20. That's 100. 5 times 5 is 25. That adds up to 625 out of 1,000. 3 decimal spots because there are 3 zeros. And in those decimal spots go 6, 2, 5. So 625 thousandths and a 0 in front. So there's 2 ways so far we've learned to convert a fraction to a decimal. The first way was by recognition or mental math. That's when the fractions are already based out of a 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, etc. The other way was by equivalent fractions, and that's if the fraction isn't out of 10, 100, or 1,000, or 10,000, we can use equivalent fractions to make it out of that. So, knowing that, I'm going to get you to do an assignment. The assignment is MP 53, the page I gave you in class. You're going to do this in your notebook. Numbers 1 to 17 is done by mental math. And numbers 18 to 33 is done by equivalent fractions. You show all the work in your notebook. We did number 1 and number 18 together in class. That's due for the next day you come back. That's all for now. Good luck. Flexing Teacher Weber out.